All right, so we're going to address responsibilities. I assume we're going to spend some time talking about solutions going forward. A lot of the things we talk about on the show, but this will give us more of an opportunity to hear from other communities, hear from some people whose background, and many of whom are in this very room, can explain history, culture, and the connection to all those people who come before us, more specifically through the language. Because the language is one of those things that record history more accurately than anything else. Because when you understand where a phrase or where a concept comes from, and you have people who know the etymology, the origins of those expressions. We oftentimes have people who can speak, and they can recite, and they can, they essentially can translate English into a native language, but not necessarily speak and think in that language. So they can take the time when they translate from native language into English, that they are not just finding word replacements, that they are spending the time to go into the expressions. And of course, here, but no, I just wanted you to share your thoughts about these kinds of meetings, especially when you have people who are thirsty for information and have been denied some of that information. And of course, by being denied, we see problems in each one of our territories, each one of our communities, where there's abuse of power oftentimes, and we know that's been one of the main issues, especially in places like Onondaga. And where people are always asking is, well, they're quick to ask what are our rights? And where I always hear from the three of you is, it's not so much about what are your rights, but what are your responsibilities. So I guess that's what I'm hoping that you can elaborate a little bit on is what are your thoughts about having the opportunity even tomorrow to address people who are curious about how we go forward in trying to almost reclaim our identity as Native people. So I guess that's my question.
John, we're never ready 100% for what we're going into tomorrow, okay? All we have is our experience, what we've seen, the problem areas, and so on. So what we're going to be saying is things that we have experienced, okay? We're not going to be directing anybody, you have to do 1, 2, 3. But we all understand we've been assimilated, okay? We're assimilated to the point where we are all living in Washington, D.C. today in the mine, okay? If not, we're living in the Vatican someplace, okay? But no one is living in themselves as an Oklahoma, like he says. See, so that's what we have to bring our subconscious back to understanding. Who am I? Where am I standing? Am I a Oneida, a Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga? None of the above. Those names were all names that were given to us by the oppressor. And then he made a history to go with every one of them, okay? We describe ourselves as a people by the land that we come from because we're related to that land. We're one with that land. And that's why we hang on the way we do, because we know we're one with Mother Earth, and we have to stand on our principles. We've had a lot of problems in the Confederacy. I'm not one to hide none of those problems, because as we've come along in our few years in our politics, okay, we have learned how an individual can stand up and tweak one word, and that word carries on for 30 years. Misconception of a very important issue in the Confederacy because of language issues. And I think tomorrow will be interesting when it comes to the language issues in the Confederacy, okay? I think one of the issues that we need to really put aside here is all of the problems that have developed with personalities within the Confederacy. In the last 30 years in the Confederacy, there's been a big division. And in the last 30 years in this Confederacy, we have all but disappeared as a Confederacy. And that needs to be touched upon. Are we going to survive? Or are we going to disappear? Or are we going to go back to the individual sovereigns that we used to be? Okay? That's an important point in itself. Because our understanding of sovereignty was that each and every individual was sovereign. Whereas in the European sense, it was only the crown that was sovereign. In the American sense, it's only the government that's sovereign. See? So we need to get that all straightened around in our subconscious.
I remember one time up in Akwesasne, one of the young guys asked me a question. I think a bunch of us were in the room at the time, and I know, James, you were there. They asked me, do you think the Guyana de Goa represented a democracy or a republic? And I had to really think about, because, again, these words, these aren't words that we break down. Certainly, it doesn't represent a democracy in really almost in any sense of the word. But it gets to what you just said, because if you look up those words on the internet, what you learn is that a democracy does not vest the sovereignty in the individual. It vests it in the people en masse. Not just the government, but it says, because it's supposed to be a government of the people, but the sovereignty is only of the people en masse, but it doesn't ever vest it right down to the individual. Where a republic, by those political scientists' definitions, does have sovereignty vested in the individual. Mm-hmm. And the difference between a democracy and a republic is that a republic, beyond the representation issues, but just the core value of what these types of governance systems are founded on. A republic accepts that there are certain inalienable rights, and those are tied to creation. And it's not necessarily a constitution, because that's, again, written by a man. But what it says is that that there are certain rights that you were born with, no matter what. And that's where sovereignty, again, when you talk about being placed with the individual. A democracy is essentially a fancy way of saying mob rule. The biggest group of people get to decide what is legal, what is right, where rights are vested. And they say, well, it's by a majority, but it isn't even a majority. It's just the largest mob. And that's never been our way. And I think that's what people have lost as we've seen the Confederacy corrupted over the years. And again, these personalities who have been infected by this sense of male domination that came from Europe and this idea of hierarchy. The concept that we shared with the white man when he showed up on our shores was that we placed people in our service. We didn't place them as leaders. And it's funny because even when you look at some of these translations of the Guyana de Goa, when they refer to the Confederate lords and even the words chief, none of these. So when you talk about correcting some of these misnomers and what Negro was talking about, this is part of the problem, because we use these words that essentially miscommunicate authority or a higher being than the rest of us, which is really just in direct opposition to everything that is a part of who we are. And when you ask these questions, and again, this is where it gets down to trying to find somebody who's an educator, and who can tie that teaching to the language. When you see this get mixed up in the language, and the time is taken. I recall a time when even many years ago with Jake Thomas, we were sitting at he was doing this presentation in Syracuse, and Paul had to stop him, and he started talking to him in the language, because something that Jake was saying in English was somehow getting lost in the translation. And so by going back into the language and him conversing, and I'll be honest, there was a room full of people who had no idea what these two guys were talking about. And then Jake came back and he thanked him for bringing it up, and then restated. Took a little bit more time to do it, because you couldn't just replace an English word for the native concept. You had to go a little farther than that, and I think that's what is for many of us in these communities that you guys have visited. For many of us, that's the opportunity that we look for when you guys come to town.
We have been all subjected to some serious misnomers. One of them, a couple of years back, according to the Confederacy, attempted to make a termination that was supposedly for the outside world, but injured us internally very deeply. When one of a faith keeper at Onondaga says that the current Tadodaho is the chief of chiefs, there is no such thing. They are Lodianesu, title holders within their clan, and their duties and responsibilities is to raise the voice of their family. They in of themselves have no authority or even should have an opinion. The other thing I'd like to say is that it's true. Many times when we are speaking to a group, we see blank eyes or blinking eyes. And one, I just want to repeat, in the longhouses, some of our ceremonies, that's the reaction we get. It's a sad state of affairs. Our young people, they know the dances. They know what Ostawagoa is. They know what Yunheko is. But do they really know the real in-depth feeling of it? Until we explain it. We need to explain what is Adungwa. We need to explain what is Te Gayandawana, the Peachstone game. We need to explain Yonehoro. We need to explain these things because they've heard it all their life, but nobody has explained it in a language that they understood. And I personally feel that we are very, very lucky to have experienced these things from the older generations to the now.
One of the things that goes through my mind is the word language. Language is not the vocabulary. Language is the thought, the thinking, and the concepts. Now, most of the time, people have their own language, what they call their own. You can go throughout the world, okay? What we have to understand and start developing is the rebirth of our language, because that's the easiest way to present the thought, if we have the thought. Because if we don't have the thought, then the language doesn't do any good anyway. Okay?
Nianen, Nichiano, Ntatnoak. Nat Tamosian, O mio sosquel, O Pemotit, and O Tehaya Netan, Watsachiwan, Nikits, Chinanaquat, Winahap no Netan, Nanima Aweaki, Escachian, Aya Matnakwakuki, Winahap no Nikutnosisa, Aya Pawakone. It has been my distinct honor to share a little bit of the Menominee language with you all today, as it has been targeted for destruction for over 150 years, and its very existence today is symbolic of the resilience of our tribal communities here in America. As I'm learning the language, I'm learning words and words and words, and I'm starting to use the words. But as I came to find out, I didn't really understand the words. And the first time I remember noticing this is when I asked her, we are called Menominee. What does that mean? And she says, oh, yeah. She says, we're called Menominee. She says, but in our own language, we call ourselves Mamache Tawak, or the movers, full of life. And I thought, wow, how amazing is that? But it opened my mind, and I started to wonder, what else was behind this language? And as I began to ask questions, I suddenly began to realize that language is the key to everything. You see, my need to learn everything in an English-based manner was quickly met by the Menominee language. And for example, a verb as simple as apeu, which in our language means he or she sits. I had recalled asking, well, how do I distinguish the difference between he and she? Well, we don't do that, you see. We have no gender hierarchy in our language. And I can recall thinking, wow, what an amazing feature. In a time and place where we're all fighting for gender equality, we had this.
Racial politics in the United States, it's safe to say in the literature, is dominated by black, and then after that you have the other categories for minorities. The fellow there is a Red Lake tribal member who's making a run at being a comedian. Sometimes pictures say more than other things. This person here is a tenured professor in the UC system. I attempted to interview her, and at that time she wasn't Native, and last statement, she is and will always be. This person is recent at Dartmouth. They are of a different identity, of a 501(c) identity. Now, getting into awkward moments, that awkward moment when you can't tell the difference between an Indian and the Asian. I crack up because I got plenty of relatives and cousins, and hey, just like a Brazilian family, phenotypes are interesting in Indian country. You could have someone who looks like my Irish side of the family, as pasty as can be and white. You have native looking, you have African American black skin color, you have Asiatic features. Physical anthro is a whole different place to dwell in, but with the discourse on natives and Facebook, it's fascinating.
If you think about, for example, the one drop laws that gave us black and white people in the first place, right? One drop, what kind of language is that, right? One drop of black blood makes a person black. Evermore. That's rather rigid. These systems of classification, what they mean, and what is particularly American about the way that it's played out over several hundred years. What I would follow, which seems to me to be common courtesy, is to call people what they wish to be called.
The Iroquois people, as you know them, we call ourselves Haudenosaunee, met with Franklin in Pennsylvania in the 1700s, and unfortunately gave them our political philosophy about unity and the bows and the arrows being bound together, which is still the American symbol. So if you look at current media coverage of any Native issue, they don't humanize us. We're a problem, and we're over here, and we got to be dealt with. The point of this whole thing is I'm not supposed to be standing here today had these policies actually been effective. But we resisted, and how we resisted was sustaining our own ideas and understanding of the world. Our language is very important, largely because it has the intellectual legacy. We have ideas that cannot be expressed in English because English has connotations with its language. The easiest one I can use is women. For many Indigenous culture, just the term, the female, is a powerful entity. She is a life giver. She is the land. She is movement, action, authority. You can't say woman in the English language and get that same connotation. So our language really does have our ways of thinking about the world and constructing the world, which is everything is living, everything is alive. And I think now science is catching up to that.
Scoutmish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh. My language is important to me because it's the foundation of my identity as a human being, as a Barquam, as an Indigenous person where I come from. None of our ceremonies or our songs or anything we do would have any context or meaning and value if it was done in English. Our language comes from our land. It's a living language, and when we talk our language, our living language, we bring to life that part of ourselves, of our ancestors that they try to kill. We're successful today in some parts that our culture has not stopped. And we need to thank the Musqueam people, the Jawadino people, for never stopping our culture, even knowing it was illegal and people were being thrown into jail. When we lose that, we lose everything. I'm very grateful that they had the foresight, just as our ancestors did, to see into the future, to leave behind with us the good ways to carry our cultural protocols.
Our culture has always been at risk. There are people today, this very day that I speak, who are encroaching upon our traditional land.
Since the beginning of American civilization, we've been losing who we are.
It's still a struggle, even against our own people sometimes, to say, you are Indian. These are the songs, these are the dances, these are the original ways that your people have thought and felt and carried on our lives and our community. And a lot of people today say that, we don't need any of that stuff. We don't need any of that stuff.
A lot of times the outside culture doesn't know about Native Americans. There's a lot of stereotypes.
Many years ago, our people have suffered. We're placed on reservations. We do not wear regular clothing. They want to dictate how we dress. They want to dictate what's in the media. I've never seen a Native American movie that looked like me, ever. And I'm 20. It's important to practice our traditional ways, because if you don't, then you lose who you are. When we drum and we sing and we speak in our native tongue, we're defying the odds. We're beating the odds of the social norm. So I don't want to be put in a category where I know who I am, but I'm forced not to because I don't practice my song. I don't practice the way we dance, or I don't practice what we eat. Because if I do that, then what would happen to our next generation? What would kids have to say then when they go to school and they don't know who they are? And a lot of people don't face that, but being from a reservation, you face that every day of your life. So that's why we practice our songs. That's why we practice the way we communicate with one another in our native tongue, or we hunt together, or we make our regalias together. Because that's who we are. We lose that, you lose everything.